knows I just started the recording of this meeting. So welcome everybody. I'm Jody Youngers, Director of Recreation and Parks for the City of Brooklyn Park. First of all, I want to thank you all for jumping on this meeting. And what I'm going to do is we will be sharing a PowerPoint and Chris will be bringing that up fairly soon. But I want to introduce a couple of people. First of all, Claudia Diggs. Claudia is a part of our community engagement team within the City of Brooklyn Park. Claudia is our neighborhood specialist and will be going over a few pointers and kind of, what do I want to say? Ground rules? I don't know if that's the right word. I want to introduce Mitch Robinson, who is a part of our engineering team within our operations and maintenance division. And Mitch was actually our the person that did the application in partnership with Chris from the Hennepin County. We did this as a duo. City was the fiscal agent, but Chris has been a really heavy partner with the county with us, and Chris will be doing a part of the presentation as well. So with that, why don't we go ahead, and what I'm going to do is to make sure that we get through the PowerPoint, I'm going to ask Chris to kind of share that, and then again, turn it over to Claudia for some ground rules before we get kicked off and started, and we'll share then the agenda for the meeting.
Oh, geez.
So good evening, folks. Thank you for joining us again. I just wanted to welcome you to the Mississippi River Stabilization Program updates meeting. And if you could, please put your name and neighborhood in the chat if you haven't already done that. You can sometimes find the chat at the
of the phone.
top.
I did it, hung it up.
And I would also ask everyone
Maybe
to mute themselves if you're not speaking. Jody, do you know how to go in and mute folks? So again, welcome, and if you would put your name and neighborhood in the chat. The chat can sometimes be found at the top of your screen, but as we just heard from Joe, that sometimes it's not at the top of your screen and it's in a little box with all of the other icons that you can use. We're also going to ask that you keep yourself muted when you're not speaking. If you come into some video delays or your screen freezing up, you can turn off your video, and that will sometimes alleviate some of the system pull so that you can be able to at least hear. Don't use the raise your hand function when it's time. Hold on one second, please. Okay. We're not using the raise your hand function. When it's time, we'll ask you to put your name in the chat if you want to speak, or we may just open it up for direct comments. And we ask that you all be patient with us as we're all navigating the technology. Thank you. That's about all I had. So again, we're going to hold our questions till the end, and then we will let you know when we are ready to take questions and comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Claudia. And then Chris is going to now share the screen, and I believe that we may have 2 comment periods, and we'll see how that works within it, because we're going to be talking specifically. And as Chris shares it, I'll go very briefly over the agenda. And Chris, if you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So what we're going to try to do today, and we have 1 hour set aside, is again, I'm Jody Youngers. For those that just joined us, we're going to go over introductions and just what led us to this day-to-day. Chris is going to talk about our meeting with the granting agency, and Chris is going to present the field work report that was a part of the grant. And then Mitch is going to be talking about the feedback that we got from the granting agency. Chris will be talking about next steps, and then once we get through the PowerPoint presentation, then we will be opening it up for any questions, comment period that we have. Next slide, please, Chris. So how did we get here? So if you recall, probably about 6 years ago, when I was into about my first year of becoming Recreation and Parks Director, we started the process for the park system planning process that looked at the entire park system, that we were putting a complete system plan together for all of the 60 parks. And then that kind of led very quickly into River Parks redevelopment plan. And it was during those neighborhood meetings that we were having that I kept getting feedback from neighbors indicating an interest in working with the individual neighbors on what was happening, that they were starting to see erosion issues within their private properties. And was there any role or relationship that the city could play in to help coordinate a more coordinated effort to how we might approach stabilizing. As the Director of Recreation and Parks, my role and responsibility is for the 60 parks. So one of the things that I had indicated to the neighbors is that I would have a conversation internally within our department. That was Mitch and Jesse Struve within our that are in charge of the stormwater management, and then connected with our partners over in Hennepin County, because they had their role is to look at the broader system of stormwater management. And so we began the conversations and actually had met with one of Chris's, the prior director within Chris's organization at Hennepin County, and Joe and a couple of members, I think that might on be here, Tim, we went to breakfast and had a breakfast meeting to kind of talk about what might be done to help the neighbors. And again, it was more about helping the neighbors understand that we could be better together, more efficient together, and what could we do to address the erosion, because so many people were seeing this. I do want to make a comment. I have received some comments from some members or neighbors, indicating, well, why now and not back when I was trying to do this? And I've already done some of my work. I wish I could say that, we can't look back at those that have done and really done the full investment, that the city wasn't engaged at that time. But I can just say we're looking forward and feel that we can play a great coordinating role. And so that kind of started the process. And then what we did is we started to meet with neighbors, and we had a kickoff meeting in June of 2020. And basically what we did is I think that was 2019. 2019 is when we had the initial first neighborhood meeting. And basically is when we introduced the whole idea of what we might be able to do as it relates to doing a grant application. And so it was at that time that we kind of talked about what the scope might be if we had neighbors truly interested. And then it was a process of where Chris was starting to get your commitment letters of interest. And so that kind of started the process, again, of what Chris is going to go over related to the assessments that were done of the different properties. So again, how did we get here is we had another public meeting in June of 2020. We did the field visits by Hennepin County staff in the summer of 2020. That was some members of the neighborhood allowed with permission for that team to actually come onto property. In other cases, we did from the river, did assessments. Chris will talk much more about this. We did also, as a part of the grant application, there were two very key things. We needed action from the city council to be the fiscal agent and to apply for the grant. And as a part of the grant application, we wanted to represent that we had the support of neighbors, the buy-in from the neighborhood, and then additionally, that we needed to come to the table with some matching dollars for the grant. And the city had provided a match of $40,000 in cash. And then we additionally talked about that we wanted to have a buy-in and a financial commitment as part of the match from individual neighbors. And so we worked out with our finance director, our city manager, and the city council, approved the ability to work with the individual property owners if the grant was awarded, to indicate that in fact the city would assess the individual property owner's responsibility to their portion of the expense for their property and assess that over 10 years. And that was optional. We additionally then completed the assessments in the fall of 2020 and then did the actual application of the grant in fall of 2020. And then finally, as Mitch is going to be talking about, is we did meet with the granting agency to get feedback because we did not get the award, and we've learned some great insight as to why that might be the case. With that, next slide. So again, from a standpoint of the project goals, again, what we have is we wanted to identify the properties that with the most critical need. Actually, Chris, I think this was your slide, was it not?
Yeah, I can take this one.
Okay, yep. Sounds great. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah.
I'm going to turn it over to Chris, and Chris has been our key partner with Hennepin County and had taken the lead on all of the assessments and has been a great partner in all this. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chris.
Thanks, Jody. So I'm going to actually revisit a lot of the slides we talked about last June during our last public meeting. So this was a lot of kind of intro for a lot of landowners in terms of what this project was and what riverbank restoration really meant and what roles both the city and the county would play in that process. So for those that attended that meeting, you're going to see a lot of the same slides, but I wanted to include them because we might have landowners here too that weren't part of that meeting and don't have much background in this process. So I wanted to go over them one more time just to make sure we're all on the same page. So these are some of the project goals we had going into the project last year. As Jody had just mentioned, identifying properties with the most critical need. So doing that site assessment report, I'll be going through to find where we really need the most public and private investment. Identifying an input from those partners and landowners in terms of what projects and work to do. Draft that site assessment report. And then apply for that grant, which, as Jody mentioned, we unfortunately did not get. But I think, as she also mentioned, got great feedback that might lead into another grant application this coming summer. And then determine the best follow-up for each landowner. For some, it might be a project, but for others, it might just be some other follow-up in terms of other landscaping or land management activities they can do if they're not going to be part of this project overall. And as I mentioned too, we did not get that grant. So some of the 2021 goals we had are now going to be 2022 goals if we do get that grant, if and when we reapply this coming summer. So if and when we do get that grant, which we can't move forward with this project, unfortunately, until we do get that grant. But if and when we do a full survey of the properties we identified, for implementation, which depending on costs might be around 6 to as much as 8 properties that we would do in this first phase. And that would occur right away in spring when dollars were made available to us from the state granting agency. Complete site-specific project designs for each of those properties, and complete contracting installation, probably somewhere in late summer, early fall, with closeout of the project activities or in fall, or potentially in early spring if there are other plantings or anything that has to occur after frost. So in terms of where we looked to do this project, we wanted to be comprehensive in this analysis. We've heard of reports of really severe damage in certain areas of the city, but we wanted to be comprehensive. So we did our initial feasibility work throughout the city area, which is what I'm showing on the screen here. So we looked at, I think, on the order of about 200 parcels that are across the city, of which that we included in that first analysis. Obviously, we didn't look at each of them on the ground, but they were each included. And some of the issues we're seeing are exacerbated by a lot of different factors. And this is a really dynamic river system, so we have to consider that. And these can be high flow rates, especially below the dam, where we're seeing above the dam water management there is a little less extreme as compared to below the dam. So that's certainly a consideration we had in mind. But of course, generally high flow across the river, we've had at least for the last 5 years, excluding last year, have had extremely high rainfall, about 5 inches on average, over the average on a given year. We've also seen increased boat traffic, which is certainly having an effect here. And lastly, bank seepage is kind of an interesting and unique aspect of this issue that is affecting certain landowners. And I'll get more into that as we get further along. This is another slide that we had in our June meeting that talked a bit about the restoration process. And I'll try to be brief in walking through each of these, but they really go in order from left to right and top down. So beginning with the top left, the pre-project conditions is really what we did last summer, evaluating each site first through desktop analysis using things like LiDAR or aerial imagery to try to determine how far the bank has moved or what changes we've seen on the landscape. And then physically walking the property, which is what either myself or my colleague Kirsten Barta did for everyone that provided a letter of intent and showed interest in the program. So that's really just getting a feel for the property itself, seeing what issues are there, and identifying if it has a critical need for stabilization. If and when the project starts, we get into that next image in the top right, which might include something like heavy equipment like we see there, might include regrading, may go as far as riprap, which we see in the kind of lower part of that image, those rocks right along the water level. Those are incorporated in my experience, more extreme cases on the riverfront, where you have cut banks or you have issues that really can't be fully stabilized through bioengineering, which is always our preference. Now going to the bottom left, we see that restoration just after construction ended. So we see that riprap, as I just mentioned, and we see erosion control blankets and fabric that are put there to help vegetation establish itself, which we see now in the bottom right. So these images progress about over 8 months or so. And would follow a pretty similar project timeline to what we'd be looking to implement, with maybe some different aspects of the project, but a similar timeline. So last summer and into early fall, we assessed 54 properties. The timeline was, as we were hurrying to get stuff done for the grant, which was in, I think, late August, early September, we looked at about 47 or 48 properties as part of that initial field assessment. And that's the report that is on the website right now. Through fall, we added about a half dozen or so additional properties, folks that didn't get in their letters of intent in time for that grant application, but we still wanted to look at their property and consider them overall. So that got us up to about 54 properties that we looked at. What you see on the right, as some of my colleagues know, some of the things we looked at. We had field maps we took out there with, in this case, the yellow lines you see are contours, elevation changes of every 2 feet. We took notes of issues that we saw, cut banks, areas of heavy erosion, other areas that the landowners may want to address unrelated to riverbank erosion as well. And we also try to consider too what the erosion source may be. And I mentioned some of them in an earlier slide. Is it being caused by the river itself? Could it be overland flow from, say, a gutter downspout, or a channel coming off a roadway maybe that's causing that erosion? That'll be really important to determining how we address that erosion issue. All that led to that project report, and this is linked on the website. And when I get done with these slides, I'll drop a link to that in our chat, so you guys can look at those if you'd like. But from that field work, that field summary really was just an overall rundown of what Kirsten and I saw in the field for each property, as well as recommendations that our team had for stabilizing those banks and for getting restoration on those properties. And those went from the properties that had very limited damage to those that had more significant damage. And I'll be going through a few images that we saw and that were included in that report that's on the website right now. So the image that you're seeing on the left are all the landowner site visits we conducted in that first field assessment in late summer. So I think we had about 48 included in that one, really across the entire city, but really focused on that area south of 610 and west and just south of Banfield Island. And then that first image here on the right is one of the kind of focused in images that we have. We have 3 of them in the report of the areas where we had damage. This is the area actually upstream of the dam. The dam would be just off to the right of that photo. In this area, we did find areas of erosion, but more minor and moderate erosion that, at least in my experience, is more consistent with wave action. They were usually focused right along that water surface level with kind of minor, what we call cavitation, but minor kind of holes below that, below the area of erosion. Again, consistent with wave action, but generally focused there. So really similar to what we see on lake systems, actually. So I don't want to minimize that erosion level that we saw there, but was a little less than what we saw further down the river, which we'll be getting into in a second. So the image we have on the left then is working south. So here we have that 610 is kind of at the top of that image. We have Banfield Island in the middle, and then River Park on the bottom of that. And here, this is the area where we really saw significant and severe erosion. Beginning from 610 and moving south, we had a bluff face just south of 610 that was pretty significant. And then along the cut bank, along Banfield Island, and then just south of the island, where we have a kind of an interesting dynamic and a few different issues that I think are adding to that problem. I'll get into that in a few slides. And then further south then, so this is just south of River Park, we found a lot less erosion down there as well, kind of consistent with minor erosion like we saw further upstream, and really typical on river systems. So there we didn't really have any significant recommendations for investment. And I have, I think, 4 or 5 slides here kind of showing what we found through images. And I'll talk briefly about what we're seeing and what we think caused it. So this is one of the more interesting ones I found, what we would call in jargon mass wasting events. But what this really is a slug of sediment that has physically detached from the bank and just slid down the slope. This is common in river systems, like in the Minnesota River Valley, where you have really big destabilizing events. So you might think of an 100-year flood event that only comes once every 100 years. Or in this case, west of Banfield Island, we also have an interesting hydrogeologic feature. So a feature of water coming out of the bluff face, coming out of the face of the bank. Usually that happens right along the water surface. If you're going to imagine taking a slice out of the ground and looking at the side of the ground, groundwater would be somewhere below that ground surface, but typically comes out right where that river water surface is in most systems. Here it doesn't. Here it comes out above the water surface. And what's happening from that is these mass wasting events where it comes out around the middle of the bank, destabilizes the bank, or really just loosens up that soil. So then when that next major flood event comes through, or when that occurs enough, and maybe the vegetation goes away or it's not set up well enough to the root systems to hold it in, that soil just kind of slides down. And that's what we see here. And the evidence of the water you're seeing here, the wetness, is consistent with that. We also found this sloughing. So this is kind of that evidence after that mass wasting event occurs, where you have these bluff faces where we have exposed root systems, trees that have fallen into the river itself. And these are pretty steep banks, on the order of about 30 to 40 feet from the water surface in midsummer to the top of that bank. So we have a lot of space here for soil to fall off. And that's really what we found in a lot of those areas west of Banfield and south of Banfield Island. Undercutting or exposed roots was also common. We also saw some of this above the dam too. So this is something you'll see a lot in lake systems too from wave action. So this isn't that uncommon. But again, we saw this near Banfill Island where you had a lot of larger cases of this than you would see in a typical lake system. And this again is evidence of wave action or flood events that have snuck under the root systems and eroded soil where the roots can't really tie it together. And then overhanging vegetation. I mentioned this before too, but these are also evidence of wave action or erosion from flooding, where the water system has just torn off effectively the side of a bank system. Okay, so we captured some of those photos in the report. We have a ton more that we've saved locally, just for long-term documentation. So what we also did in the report was provided some recommendations for how we would approach addressing this problem. And a couple of things we wanted to consider too is if we did a large project, which was kind of what Jody and Mitch and I had in mind kind of moving forward, where we kind of pooled resources both from city, county, and from landowners and from the state, what would be the best way to invest that? And one of the things we considered are having a lot of properties close to one another that are doing the project together, is there cost savings in that? And from the research I did, there is. You can lower mobilization costs. There's only a couple areas that the contractor has to set up equipment. A lot less transportation costs from one site to another. So there's some cost savings there. And it happened too that we had a lot of properties with severe erosion right next to one another too. A very high severity, and this is just west of Banfill, the site grouping on the left. And then the site grouping on number 2, which is on the right, the image on the right, is just south of Banfill Island. You can see the tip of the island right in the middle of the river system. So in both cases, we had what we figured were some good cost savings by having these properties grouped together. So what we did in the report was for each of these sites, I should back up a second. In the report, what we did too was for each site, looked at the cost to address it. So what engineering solutions are most appropriate? Could we use bioengineering? Would we need something more hard armored, considering the challenges that we have on those sites? And what cost would that be? And to develop a cost effectiveness number for each of those. And then we took that and found what cost savings we can get from doing projects together by grouping properties. And that's where we came to the conclusion that the site grouping 1, this high priority, would be what we would apply for the grant. So with I'll pause there. I know there's a lot more I can cover more in that report. There's a bunch of tables. There's also some ecological considerations we had at the end. We have a staff ecologist that put a lot of thought towards, what are activities we can include in this that would protect turtles and other, reptiles, amphibians, even fish, macroinvertebrates that are in this area too, that we're going to include with the design items. So I would encourage you to go and explore that. And I'll drop it into the chat too, so you guys have access to that. And with that, I might throw to Mitch to take us from there.
All right, thanks, Chris. So we took all of that information that Chris and his team put together and put it in for a grant submittal through the Clean Water Fund Projects and Practices Grant. This is a annual grant that's put out by the Minnesota Board of Soil and Water Resources. That ultimately ended up being a $660,000 grant request we put in for an $880,000 project. So they require a 25% match or so for the from the city, county, and landowner was providing that. This was covering, I believe it was about 700 feet or so, 6 to 7 properties was the thinking there. And so we were focusing on the project area on site grouping 1, kind of like Chris had mentioned there, concentrating on the worst, the highest severity erosion areas and kind of grouping those all together in an area to save on those mobilization costs. So if you want to flip to the next one there, Chris. And we were unfortunately not awarded the grant. We came just shy of their funding threshold. I believe it was 75 points that we needed. We had 70 or something along those lines. So we were very close, but not quite to the to where they were looking for. So some of the feedback that we got, the main feedback that we got from the state was to kind of connect this project more directly to the city plans and more importantly, the watershed plans. So we have been working with the West Mississippi watershed. They knew of the project, but it was not officially called out in any of their plans or CIP projects. So since that time, we've been talking with them and working with them to see how we can get that incorporated into their CIP projects moving forward. Some of the kind of lesser stuff that we had to clean up on some of the other feedback that we got was some project benefits that reaching towards regional water quality and natural resources needs. This is more, I mean, we had some language in there about sediment erosion and how much we were losing on an annual basis out there, but it was kind of some technical language that needs to be cleaned up on our end. And same kind of goes for the last bullet point there as far as emphasis on need and urgency, such as threats to infrastructure and natural resources for the project. So with that, I believe, Chris, you're up next for kind of where we go from here.
I think, Mitch. So the next steps here, at least starting in the spring of this year, first is re-engaging landowners, which starts with this meeting. So thanks everyone for coming. I want to make sure that we hear from you guys, understand your thoughts from what we did last year, and what we can learn from that and what we can incorporate for work coming up this spring, summer, and fall. I also want to make sure we reaffirm interest with residents too, and we'll be working on what that looks like, whether it's another letter of intent or some other way to engage with you. We also want to meet with new landowners. So if there's any landowners on this call now that weren't part of our program last summer, be sure to connect with us and we can use that chat to do it. In a perfect world, we could talk to one another face-to-face in person, but COVID and all. We can use this and we can exchange information via Teams. I'll also drop my email in the chat too. Feel free to use that. We can connect one-on-one as well to maybe set up another site visit this spring or a new site visit this spring. And speaking of that, we also wanted to do more site visits. We want to return to at least a few properties that we saw last year to take some better photos. Our timing wasn't perfect because when we were out there in summer, by then a lot of vegetation had already started to set up. So a lot of those erosion features that you want to get nice, pretty photos of for your grant application were already covered with vegetation. So hopefully we can get out earlier in spring and beat the vegetation out. And then of course the new properties that we didn't see last year, we want to make sure we look at those and get those fully assessed. And then with that too, we'll incorporate some of the feedback that Mitch mentioned that we got from the granting agency as well. Make sure that's incorporated into both the feasibility report and as well our grant application itself. So that takes us through spring and summer. We'll be updating that site assessment report. There were a few items too from fall. I want to make sure I included in an update of that as well. Some items that I got from some of the landowners I worked with, and then of course the ones that came in later after the grant application. We also want to verify our costs are still accurate. I have experienced, and I'm sure anyone else has that's hired a contractor in the last year, that costs are very high, both for materials and labor. So we want to make sure that our costs are accurate and will, hopefully set us up for success if and when we get that grant. And then obviously including the new information on properties as well. And that will all lead to what we plan to be another Clean Water Fund Projects and Practices application this coming fall. And we've already worked with our Board of Water and Soil Resources or Bowser granting agency to make sure we're all set for that and got all our ducks in a row. So that's all I got now. So Jody, I'm gonna throw back to you for open discussion.
All right, that sounds great. First of all, something I want to say is when Chris talked about that we were very close to being funded, in a grant application, when you can get 20 points for aligning all the different master plans and capital improvement plans, we didn't get a significant portion of that 20 points that we had talked about, and that could have really elevated our project. So that could have made the difference. So we just want you to know that the conversation we had with the granting agency, number one, they are encouraging us to reapply. obviously encouraging us to get the areas where we didn't get the points, to make sure that we hone in on those areas. And they were not afraid that this project might need to be funded over multiple years. And that was something that I was concerned about. You know, did the need for additional properties, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and possibly even a phase 4 approach to this grant application, they weren't afraid of that. They realized and see this as a important project. It's just, we just need to, you know, make sure that we're addressing that, some of their issues around the making sure all the agencies involved have it in their capital improvement programs. So I just wanted to emphasize that we're doing everything in our power on your behalf to put in and address what it takes to do a great grant application. So I just wanted to kind of add those thoughts. With that, there were a couple of questions that came up in the chat, but I do have one person that has raised their hand. And with that, I am going to, now I need to see who that was. I want to say, was it Brian?
It's Brian. And also, Brian, before you start, Jody, we have to remember that we also have folks on the phone that we'll need, that don't have this feature, that we'll need to let folks on the phone know that if they have any questions, when they can jump in.
Great. So we have Brian has his hand raised, and then after that, Joe Close. So Brian? And you'll have to take yourself off mute, Brian. While Brian is figuring that out, and maybe Brian doesn't, Joe, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, first of all, I'd want to thank, certainly all the people from the city as well as from Hennepin County. All of this started probably about 6-7 years ago. And in regards to that is that, I don't think we should be discouraged at all. Some significant things have taken place in regards to the assessment has happened. A number of us belong to the Isaac Walton League, and we were continuously being asked about how people should address their riverbanks.
Mm-hmm.
Great news out of that is that, the team that came out and did the assessments has made some great, discovered a great amount of things that can be done. The other nice thing about it is it's going to be based upon best practices and science. So what'll be done is going to be great and permanent, and it's not going to be a temporary solution. So it's going to be a resource bank for people to go to on how to effectively manage their specific projects. The second part of it is that this is really teams in well as a dual prong for the city, because Cindy Sherman has a responsibility from the city to have an action plan for how the city is going to deal with all of this. So it dovetails exceptionally well with things that the city needs to do. Combination with that, I believe the city owns over 20% of the shoreline in Brooklyn Park, and some great things are taking place on the city behalf. So it's not just the few properties that will be addressed to start with. There's going to be a substantial amount of the shoreline in Brooklyn Park that over the next couple of years, some remarkable things are going to be happening with. So I think I see it as a very, very positive thing. Thank you.
Yeah, and Joe, on that, additionally, with our partnership with Three Rivers and the Mississippi Gateway, one of the things in recent, we're starting to work through the design development is they are going to be doing a little bit more work. They've done some restoration work for the access point that leads down to the canoe kayak launch area, but additionally, they will be putting a little bit more emphasis into the shoreline stabilization along their entire stretch of the river as well. So that will be another next phase as a part of their development. So you are absolutely right. It's both we both have private and public lands that we're trying to work in harmony with each other here so we can address the amount of, pollutants, phosphorus and other elements, and then stop the erosion issues along the banks of the river, because we know that impacts the water quality as well. So good point. Do we have any other hands raised at this point? Questions?
No, we don't have any hands raised. I did find Brian's question, I believe. His question was, it's in the chat. Is there a way to find out the impact on our specific properties?
Do you want to take that one, Chris?
Yeah, again, so yes, there is. In that link I dropped in the chat on the site assessment report, on pages, I can look there right now, 17 through 22, we have tables there where each row is a property. And it talks about what we found in terms of the linear feet height where we saw significant erosion, what we think has been lost from that in terms of in this case tons of soil and tons of phosphorus too that's being lost into the river system, and then also what we considered for severity in terms of severe, moderate, low, and then cost to address. So and for anyone on the phone too, obviously you can't see our chat. Google Brooklyn Park Stabilization, Mississippi Stabilization. So again, that's Brooklyn Park, Mississippi Stabilization, and that'll get you to our project website. And from there, you can find this report. But if you go there, then you can see information on your specific property and some of the recommendations that we had to address. And I'll add too that this site assessment was only meant to be that first stage to get us prepared for a grant. The intent then, after we had that grant, was to do more site-specific design work that would look more at, let's say in my recommendations on the report, we said you should look at bioengineering, or you should look at hard armoring through something like riprap. We'd have a design engineer go and do surveys on that property and do more intensive analysis on each of those properties. So it would be another layer beyond what we did in this report. So just want to add that caveat.
Does anyone on the phone have a question? You can jump in after we speak with James. James has his hand up.
Hi. Yeah, Chris, quick question for you. Were you saying my property is right across from Banfield Island, and were you saying there was a lot of groundwater issues with the bank there, so that the water is actually coming up from the bank? Did I understand you correct on that?
Yep. So what I was describing was water coming from the bank, from probably somewhere along the middle part of the bank, what we might call seepage, where it's not coming out at the water surface. It's coming out somewhere above it. And that wasn't consistent, if I'm being honest too. There were many homeowners west and south of Banfield that weren't experiencing that. And that's probably due to some complex geology along those banks, kind of the ways and the layers of sediment that kind of got packed down as that river formed. But I think for most of homeowners through there, that's probably what they were experiencing, is water coming out from the side of the bank above the water surface and then running down the bank and destabilizing the bank. I think that's probably a very big factor for most of the folks that were labeled severe erosion on those maps I showed.
Okay. Yeah, because I was curious, because I've just noticed I've been here almost 9 years now at this property, and I've lost a couple oak trees that were sitting kind of on the bank there. And I'm also noticing on the bottom of the bank, there's a lot of erosion, and trees are just kind of, the root balls and stuff are getting exposed quite a bit. And I was trying to figure out why that's happening, because I know the water does rise, in the spring and all that, and you definitely get, high water there coming along, wiping out some of that, but it didn't explain some of the things that I'm seeing higher up on the bank. And I'm wondering if that groundwater is affecting the soil up there, and then, having an effect on the trees and the root system holding on to the bank itself.
Yeah, and I'm sure it is, or I think it's likely it is in your area.
Okay. So then we just need to get a hold of you then, if we didn't get part of the first assessment, then to have you come out then, just to call you. Is that the best thing to do, or email you?
I'm going to drop my email. Yep, I'm gonna drop my email and phone number in the chat. And I'll actually just say my number for those that are on the phone, 612-596-1171. So 612-596-1171. And I'll put both of those in the chat too for those that didn't have a pen and paper out.
Great. Thank you.
Tim has a question in the chat. Will you be able to recommend best practices for shoreline vegetation restoration? Are we talking about prior to or after the area? So maybe we need some clarification from Tim, but unless you fully understand that, Chris.
I can take both actually. So, you know, if you're part of the program with restoration, that would be included in the design. We work with our ecologists and other landscape specialist staff to determine vegetation that's appropriate, both for the soil type and for the amount of water that plant's going to see. But most people on this call may not be involved in that project right away. And if you want to do any work earlier on, shoot me an email or give me a call, and I'll get you connected with those resources. I don't pretend to be a plant guy. I'm probably not the best resource for that, but we have other staff that are well versed in that. And there's other resources online too I can point you towards as well, that can walk you through some of both the types of plants that you should look at and some recommended nurseries that provide safe seeds and other smaller plants you can look at, including.
Chris, let me just add on to that question I asked. What about maybe not restoration, but prevention? Let's say some of the properties that you've said are not looking too bad right now.
Yep.
Can you make suggestions for those property owners on what to do and what not to do to stabilize their banks?
Yeah, so on one-on-one, definitely. That wasn't something we included in the report, but now that you say it, Tim, that might be helpful. Because even for implementation, we're probably only looking at doing this for up to 24 properties, and there were 200 along the shore. But yeah, we can look at including that. So whether that's connecting one-on-one or including it in the report, I think either is fine. What would you prefer there, Tim?
I think it'd be a great thing as an educational tool to just have it out there for any property owner to pick it up now or to look at it later on.
Okay.
I noticed some properties, we look across to Fridley. We see what's happening along the banks in Fridley from our side, and it's just outrageous what some of the property owners are doing. They're setting themselves up for big problems with this clear cutting.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the wrong thing to do. Yeah. Okay. Are there any questions? Oh, go ahead.
I know this is Brooklyn Park, but it's, I've observed a tremendous amount of clear cutting on the Fridley side of the river, but and I hope somebody will address that at some point.
Yeah, typically, one of the things that I've been trying to do in my prior work in Ramsey County, where I had basically a lake in every park. We started to allow for the tall grasses and never mowing up to the end of the of the lake shore, so to speak. First of all, it is your pollutant capture. And second of all, it's your stabilization, heavier roots that stabilizes the end of the bank. So that's just a real important shoreline management practice. And then, of course, riprap and other support designs to, kind of a combination of natural taller grasses with riprap is another option and choice for that management, especially if you haven't had this type of drastic erosion like we've had. So, but I'm not the expert. Chris is much more versed in this, especially when it comes to the river. So, yeah, no, good point, John. Any other questions that you have? So Just kind of to recap, what we're going to do and what we're asking of you is, again, the purpose of this meeting is to kind of check in with you. Many of you were wondering what happened with the grant, and unfortunately, and I believe we were notified sometime in late December, if I'm not mistaken, Chris, and Mitch, and we wanted to get back with you, but we also wanted to learn from the agency why we didn't get funded. And we're being completely transparent with what we learned on behalf of all of us. But they did like our proposal. They liked the project. So our plan is, again, as Chris and Mitch indicated, is we do plan to bring this application back to the city council for, again, their approval, because that's a part of the process that's required. Additionally, we will, and a part of that process is also making sure that the council is supportive of the match, putting aside a contribution from the city, along with the process for assessing property owners if that's the choice or that they take that option. And so we do have to go through that part again. But as Chris has indicated, really being able to get that additional commitment from you to say, yes, we're still interested. And then again, like Chris indicating, getting those better pictures in the spring will help show a better picture of the erosion going on. So a spring shot versus a fall shot when vegetation was there was important. So what we do plan to do is, for those members, I did take a snapshot of those that are on this in the participation. So I can see either your phone number or who you are as a part of joining this meeting. But we do have the emails that Chris got from you when you did do your actual approval to get on the property. If you're a new member and hadn't been involved last year, we will want to have you connect with Chris and get that permission slip to come onto the property so that he can take those pictures. And so Chris and Mitch, Claudia, what am I forgetting before we let them know on next steps in just kind of in summary?
Just a quick, did you see my message about attendance?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
And I did take a snapshot of the participation.
Okay. I don't think there's anything. We have contact information for Jody and Chris. Yeah, I think that's it.
And we did have one question I'm saying we didn't get to.
Okay.
Where was it? Shoot, I was just going through and missed it. From Mike Bouchard. His property he didn't find in the table, and there are a handful, especially if that was when I looked at in fall, that I may not have included in this most recent set of documents. I will be revisiting that and adding that this spring as we do more site visits. So that'll be added here in the coming weeks or month or so. So yeah, let me know. And as a heads up too, the missus and I are expecting a baby here soon, so you'll be seeing me for the next few weeks, and then you may not hear from me at all for a while. In spring, when I told you I'd be seeing you soon, but if you don't hear anything from me, I'm busy. I'll get back to you as soon as I can.
Well, Chris, that's news. I didn't know that. Congratulations. How exciting is that?
Well, it's terrifying and exciting. We already have one, so we kind of know what we're up for, but we're now having to play man-to-man defense, before we can take turns taking time off. A little frightening.
Awesome. That's great. Wonderful. Good. Do we have any final last questions, comments? Was this helpful? Were you kind of looking for an update? Was that helpful? We're trying to stay in touch.
Great job, and thank you very much.
All right, sounds great. So again, if you're new to the process, you get a hold of Chris and he'll get you a form that kind of gives him permission to kind of come onto your property and making that contact. It also gives us your email address. So we do have email addresses for a majority of those groups. So you'll likely get an email from us saying, are you still in? And I don't know, Chris, if you're going to require them to fill out a new form or just validate.
No new form. Nothing would change from the previous one. I think when we get, for those where I want to take new photos, I already have the properties in mind. I'll reach out to them probably in the coming, probably actually closer to April or May.
Great.
That's still early enough before vegetation sets in, and hopefully the river will have gone down a little bit. But in terms of those that have submitted it, you don't need to submit another one. I might reach out via email and just verify that you're still on board, or that you haven't moved or something has changed. But if that is the case and you aren't, or you are no longer interested, do let me know that, because I want to make sure that we consider that when we move forward.
Yeah, and if you know of a neighbor that either is new or is kind of new to the project, you hadn't participated on this, that doesn't mean that they can't eventually get involved in this. So just, you know, talk to your neighbor, give them Chris's email address, see how quick I am to get it to Chris. To get Chris, it's so that we can at least gather the information and know what the property is, and that we actually have that information and that person's connected to this work. So I hope you all realize we're trying to do this on your behalf, along with our behalf, because we want to be a good steward of the river. Water quality is incredibly important to all of us. It is in many places. In Brooklyn Park, obviously we're off of a well system, but there is a whole lot of the communities that draw straight from the river as the primary draw for drinking water. And so it is really important. Water quality on the river is important to all of us around the whole United States, because Mississippi River is a big water resource. So thank you for everything you do to be stewards, and this project's very important to all of us. So anyway, final comments, Chris, anything?
Nothing. Thanks,
Okay.
Jody, and thanks everyone for coming.
And Mitch?
Nothing for me.
Thank you very much. And Claudia?
Thank you for coming. Stay connected with the City of Brooklyn Park. Sign up for emails and text alerts.
And then in the chat, I did, again, as Chris indicated, I just did the test and I Googled what he said, which is Brooklyn Park, Mississippi, or Neighborhood Stabilization Project, and boom, it came up, and I threw that right in the chat. So for those that are on the phone, that's a pretty quick Google search and get you right to the spot of the report on the city's website. Thank you, everybody. Stay connected, as Claudia said, and thanks for being good neighbors. Take care.
Thank you, Brooklyn Park.
You bet. Bye-bye now.
I can sign on.